In this section, we'll look at the music of the youth counterculture in the 1960s. And of course, if you're going to talk about the music of the 1960s, you should probably start with the Beatles. George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon. They were rooted originally in the skiffle in 1950s rock and roll. They were from Liverpool, England. And they're going to grow and dominate rock for almost a decade as they experimented with musical styles ranging from like pop ballads to Indian music to psychedelia to hard rock. And they even had a little bit of classical music mixed in with their classically trained producer George Martin. Originally, at the outset, they were known as the Fab Four, and their longer style hairdos became known as the mop tops, and in many respects helped launch the longer hairstyles of the 1960s. They had their first hits in 1962, 1963 with songs such as Please, Please Me and Love Me Do. Then came hits such as She Loves You. They always had a youthful, irreverent style which the media loved, and the Beatles gained a lot of attention from the media. When they came to the United States in 1964, what was called Beatlemania was in full swing. It's kind of a riotous enthusiasm, especially among teenage girls. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, which gave them national publicity. It was one of the highest rated shows of its day. In the years that followed, the Beatles came out with a number of iconic albums, but they stopped touring in 1966 because of the massive crowds. The Beatles were certainly musical leaders of the counterculture with their experimentation in drugs, and indeed their most famous album, one of the most famous albums, is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which showed a lot of psychedelic influences. The band also experimented with things like Indian religion and transcendental meditation, even traveling to India. In the late 60s, they were worldwide famous, and they formed their own record label, Apple, and their music by this point was growing more intricate and had more depth and arguably more of an edge to it. It kind of goes with the late 60s. Whereas before they were singing things like I Want to Hold Your Hand, by the end they were singing things like Why Don't We Do It in the Road. They always were active in politics and liberal causes. The Beatles broke up finally in 1970, but they remain one of the best-selling bands in history, and they hold the record for #1 hits. All of them went on to successful single careers. John Lennon was famously assassinated in 1980, and George Harrison died of throat cancer years later. The Beatles were at the vanguard of a number of British bands coming over to America, including a number of bands which showed up in 1964 and became known as the British Invasion. A number of these bands remain famous today. For example, the Rolling Stones with their lead singer Mick Jagger and their lead guitarist Keith Richards, who had albums like Sticky Fingers or Beggar's Banquet or Exile on Main Street, and are still playing today. You have bands like The Who, shown at the bottom left, with their lead guitarist Peter Townsend and the singer Roger Daltrey, who are also still playing today and had albums like Tommy and Quadrophenia. You also had groups like The Kinks and Eric Burdon and the Animals. You have a number of bands coming over here in the 1964, which became great hit makers in the United States. By the late 1960s, you're beginning to see music that would be later called heavy metal. One British band, Led Zeppelin, became quite famous in the late 60s and early 70s. While the British musicians were important to American music in the 1960s, there were American artists that were just as important. Up there with the Beatles was, of course, Bob Dylan, or Robert Zimmerman from Duluth, Minnesota. He had sort of a folkish-inspired hits like Blowing in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin'. He would always have inventive lyrics and have political or social overtones to his songs like the folk music of old. there was reasons for his singing. He later mixed in a number of different musical styles, and matter of fact, he was actually booed when he first went electric. But he dabbled in all sorts of different music, and he's still playing today, and is considered one of the musical geniuses along with the Beatles. One of the biggest American-born bands was the Beach Boys, and they first began in 1961 in Hawthorne, California. Like the Beatles, the Beach Boys evolved. First, they were focusing on California surf music, such as Surfin' Safari. But by the end of the 60s, they were experimenting as well with overdubbing and remixing, and you see complicated albums like the Pet Sounds. Always throughout, however, I should note the harmonies were the key to this band's success. Its driving force was Brian Wilson, who struggled with some mental illness throughout his life. Probably the American band that's most associated with the San Francisco psychedelic scene was, of course, the Grateful Dead, with their lead singer Jerry Garcia. The Grateful Dead lived in San Francisco, were part of the Summer of Love, and they never really had a lot of hits, but they had a very cult-like following, and of course this went on into Jerry Garcia's death in 1995. One American guitarist that was quite noteworthy was Jimi Hendrix, an Army veteran from Seattle. He had huge hands and could really play an amazing guitar, was renowned for his guitar playing. He had hits like Purple Haze. The vinyl record industry, of course, exploded with all these recording artists, and you see album sales skyrocketing. You also see things you don't see today. 8-track tapes were the music of choice for a lot of cars, and cassette tapes were available as well. You didn't have DVDs or, of course, anything digitalized quite yet. The youthful rock music of the 1960s fit in well with FM radio. FM radio was first created in the 1930s, but by 1961 FM was broadcasting in stereo, and record companies developed it as sort of an alternative rock formula. It centered more on albums, longer songs, and less on the formulaic, 3.5-minute pop hits that were common on AM radio. Of course, the most famous event in the 1960s counterculture music scene was the Woodstock Festival from August 15th to August 17th, 1969. Billed as 3 days of peace and music held at Max Yasgur's 600-acre dairy farm in the Catskills in New York, the concert had 32 acts performing outdoors. But word spread so much that it grew out of control and ended up with well over 400,000 people showing up, and so it kind of became a free concert. The rain came, and but it didn't do much to dampen the spirits. Even as the crowds shut down the New York State Thruway, and organizers had to rush to get in the necessary supplies for all the masses, the music went on. You have, amazingly, there were no discernible violence, and Woodstock remains today emblematic of sort of the peak of the hippie peace counterculture. Among the acts playing were the Who, the Jefferson Airplane, Santana, shown on the top right here, just getting started, Janis Joplin, Grateful Dead, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and it ended with Jimi Hendrix, shown on the top left here, who did his famous Star-Spangled Banner on his guitar. As the counterculture music scene grew, it soon had its own magazine called Rolling Stone. First formed in 1967 in San Francisco by Jan Winter. It helped make a lot of records possible. They always wanted their bands on the cover of Rolling Stone, and it helped make the Arthur Hunter S. Thompson more famous when Rolling Stone serialized a number of his articles. Hunter S. Thompson, of course, became famous for gonzo journalism. In any event, this concludes the section on music in the 1960s.